real pleasure to introduce Kaiama Glover today to speak to us. We have, I think, always tried to communicate that we would love our fellows to consider the Institute their home, even a virtual home, after they have left the Institute. And we have proof of concept in a way today, because Kaiama was a fellow with us last year. And we've always been in touch, and it's an enormous pleasure to have you back with us, Kaiama, today. Thank you so much. Let me just say a few words of introduction. Kaiama is the Anne Whitney Olin Professor of French and Africana Studies at Barnard and Faculty Director of the Barnard Digital Humanities Center, which is of more than usual interest to us right now. She is the author of a book, Haiti Unbound, which explores a number of neglected Haitian literary figures and asks interrogates both Haiti's place in the Caribbean, its marginal place in Caribbean studies, but also their marginal place in the larger community of Francophone literature. And when she was with us, and I guess still, was working on a fascinating Cold War Haitian poet called René Depestre, and is working on a manuscript about him, and gave us a wonderful talk last year about him. Thank you. And is also editor, or one of the editors, I guess we will find out, of an online platform for Caribbean studies called Archipelagos. And she's going to talk to us today on Blackness and Borders. We will keep to the usual format in which the dictator, James, will mute everybody. And then at the end, if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand in the chat function, and either Kaiama or Kaiama, I think probably, will just go and pick questions, and we'll have a question and answer session. Thank you very much. Kaiama, over to you. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, very much, Mark, and to the Institute more broadly for inviting me to be part of this online adventure. I really treasured my time in Paris, and I'm grateful to still be part of the Institute family. I hope, as you said, that there has been an ability to kind of keep up the community to some degree, because it really was a very special point in my career, and I am taking with me both the connections I made during that time, but also some very new ways of thinking about the work that I was doing there and have been doing since. So for my presentation today, it'll be a combination sort of a lecture and a show and tell, and over the course of which I'm going to do first some framing of, as you saw in the description, the material, the social, and the ethical considerations involved in creating and nurturing digital communities and archives of the Caribbean and its diasporas. So start with that framing, and then I'm just going to walk you through some of the projects I've been actively working on over the last few years, projects that in this global pandemic-inspired, perhaps somewhat begrudging digital turn, projects I hope will feel like scenes of possibility for our current scholarly context. What I hope to illustrate are the ways in which digital scholarship can expand and challenge institutional formations that marginalize largely global South researchers and research interests, the ways in which digital humanist scholars, especially those of us who have the benefit of being cited in the resource-richer North Atlantic, the ways in which digital humanist scholars can establish and also sustain connections with a wider transnational community of collaborators. So I don't know how familiar or not folks are with digital humanities work. So at the risk of being perhaps a little bit pedantic, I'm going to start off with some simple definitions, a simple question really, but a question that doesn't have a simple answer. What are digital humanities? So forgive me for those of you who are out there coding and Zooming and whatever else. I'm just going to start with some basics, because I am actually, despite the title faculty director of the Digital Humanities Centers, it was a very, very steep and rapid onboarding to this world. So it's helpful to me always to think about what it is when we say digital humanities, because it can mean so many things. So I'm just going to offer a few definitions or objectives of the digital humanities. Most simply put, to be a digital humanist requires only participation on whatever level in the making of something digital. right? So it doesn't mean being able to program or knowing how to code. It's simply engaging with the digital sphere in any respect, from what we're doing right now, literally, to building a website, to designing a coding language, right? So there's a long and vast and diverse gamut, or a range of things that count as digital humanities. Digital humanities work consists of using information technology to better analyze and comprehend literature, history, the human record. Anything that falls under that rubric counts, right? So digital humanities is very much humanist. It's a way or a tool or a perspective that allows us to think about the human, and that's not dissimilar to the ways we already do so in our analog context. Digital humanities is also, of course, the study of the digital from humanist perspectives, right? So it's a movement back and forth in either direction. What else? Digital humanities means using a computer to conduct research, right? So using a computer to better understand data that's been gathered either digitally or analog. So again, this movement back and forth between what's happening on a screen, of course, and what's happening in archives or in books, etc. All to say, digital humanities comprises a vast range of multimedia, and it's as wide open as the category of the humanities itself. So that's just the basic platform that I operate out of as I do the work that I do in this field. Also, a quick disclaimer. So as I said, I'm relatively new to the digital humanities. I've only been doing this for the past 7 years, and the first 2 years was pretty much done in a state of abject confusion and overwhelming feeling. And I remain very much a lover of the analog, of that earlier technology that is the book. And this hasn't changed, it won't change. I also want to say that over the course of this relatively short time, that vis-a-vis the wider scope of my career, this relatively short time I've been doing DH work, I've become aware and been advised and gleaned that there are a number of myths and misinformation that can obscure the practical realities underlying technology. What information studies scholar Joanna Drucker has identified as, quote, the pixel dust induced illusions. And this is a very real sort of set of fantasies about DH and its relationship to the academy. And these illusions include the idea, for example, that digital humanities are going to solve the so-called crisis of the humanities, that the digital humanities eliminate the need for capital and human resources, or in any event, severely or significantly limit those needs. The idea, the illusion that digital humanities work is always cheap or freely accessible. The idea that it's permanent, or the idea that it's the opposite in some way of traditional scholarship. The truths of the matter are that digital humanities work requires, or should require, as I said earlier, as much and as substantive humanist labor as traditional scholarship. Another truth is that long-term sustainability in the digital humanities is costly and difficult, if not impossible, to guarantee. Open access is not a given. Crowdsourcing requires strict guidelines and effortful curation. And design innovation for design innovation's sake is both unhelpful and annoying, right? So the idea that let's just wave a wand and turn this analog thing into something digital because we can is one of the most resource wasting, both human and capital resource wasting aspects of digital humanities work. So something that, again, has to be kept in mind as if or when one embarks on these sorts of projects. I think it's crucial for me to understand my own work in the digital humanities not as a refusal of traditional scholarship and its problems, but rather as valid and valuable in its own right, as responding to different concerns, different interests perhaps, but always as a complement and not as a replacement. I'm committed to integrating digital humanities work into my more traditional scholarly activity, and that's precisely what I tried to do and I'm still doing with a project that I'll talk about later and that I brought to the Institute during my time there last year. So not abandoning traditional scholarship for digital humanities, new pleasures in the digital humanities, but rather to enhancing my work as a researcher and a writer and a member of a scholarly community by kind of adding digital humanities work to my intellectual and skills toolkits. And I also say, just as a Caribbeanist in particular, the digital humanities have proven particularly useful to these kinds of objectives, sort of next level to the work I've already been doing. Because, and one of the arguments I want to make here is that there are a number of specific responsibilities or capacities or concerns even for Caribbeanist DH scholars that engaging in digital scholarship from the space of the Caribbean feels in many ways logical and organic. And what I mean by that is to say that in the Caribbean, in its diasporas and in work around Caribbean studies, we are already quite well accustomed to functioning within the context of the hybridized, the network, and the trans of transnational, transcolonial, transatlantic, etc. We are very accustomed as scholars to being attentive to labor structures, especially in the face of limited resources and technologies in the communities we engage with. So something of a DIY orientation that really serves DH studies as well, or DH work as well. As Caribbeanists, we're used to thinking deeply about the forms of hegemony and hierarchy that are built into so-called neutral ideas and spaces and narratives. And we're used to approaching archives and other institutions with a healthy dose of skepticism. So just to, I realize we're all from a bunch of different disciplines and areas, regions of study. So just to situate the field of Caribbean studies and its arguable ascendance over the last decade or 2 decades, let's say, the field of Caribbean studies has over the past decades expanded substantially and had a profound influence on the geography and politics of knowledge in the academy in general. Work on this region inherently and insistently engages global histories and cultural currents while cultivating and celebrating interdisciplinary approaches as part of its ethos. The Caribbean region has been central in shaping global political, intellectual, literary, and cultural currents for centuries. And starting in the late 1960s, let's say, scholars have founded organizations to gather together and promote scholarship in the region. And some of these include the Association of Caribbean Historians, which was founded in 1969 in the Eastern Caribbean, and then followed by the Caribbean Studies Association, which first met in Puerto Rico in 1975. Another example would be the Haitian Studies Association, which was founded in 1989, and so on. So just over the course of the last half century, or 30 to 40 years, we've had this ascendance of these organizations that have tended to think the Caribbean more independently from the nation language empires that were at the origins of its emergence, let's say. All of these associations foreground a commitment to supporting the work of academics in the region and in the diaspora, a commitment to multilingualism, and an interest in linking scholarly work, or the work that we do in our academic forums, with the work of artists and activists from outside the space of the academy. Within the US, Caribbean studies scholars work in a wide range of disciplines. As some of you may know, space has certainly been made for literary and cultural production in the Americas in both English and comparative literature programs, French and Francophone studies programs, Spanish and Latin American studies departments. And then, of course, in the fields of anthropology and history, the work of scholars like Sidney Mintz, Michel Wolf-Couillot, anthropologists, too numerous to name especially, have centered the region within broader theoretical debates. And of course, Caribbean intellectuals like Frantz Fanon, Edouard Glissant, Sylvia Wynter, Aimé Césaire, the list goes on. These figures have become mainstays in post-colonial studies. Yet, however, while Caribbean studies have found something of a home in many different disciplinary contexts, they nevertheless have had trouble finding consistent institutional support for reasons that I'll go into in a moment. Students and scholars face multiple challenges as they try to pursue their work within established academic frames. We too often find ourselves having to argue for and advocate for our legitimacy within the nation language departments we're generally situated in, right? For our specificity, let's say, within Africana studies departments that presume the hegemony of US Black studies while leaving space of distinction perhaps for Black Africa, but not necessarily for the wider Americas. Space of a different sort of Blackness, bordered differently in different relation to the North Atlantic. All to say, while the rich cross-disciplinary dialogue that shapes work in Caribbean studies is intellectually generative, it can also be institutionally constrained. In the best of circumstances, Caribbeanists are supported by institutions precisely because our work touches on so many areas and is so cross-cutting. Yet for graduate students and junior scholars, bringing together the interdisciplinary, multilingual, and often unprecedented methods prized in the field itself can be met with suspicion or downright hostility within particular disciplines and departments. So to work in Caribbean studies means navigating contradictory pulls and pressures finding a place at the crossroads of often conflicting agendas and institutional visions. So all of this is backdrop to say that my work in the digital humanities over the last few years has been in part an effort to contribute to the expansion and anchoring of Caribbean studies as a methodological humanist vanguard within the US Academy. It's been a reflection of my firm belief that our field has a crucial role to play in propelling forward work on space and the environment, race and gender, art and capital, and in reconfiguring our sense of what literary and artistic work can and should be with respect to the Caribbean and more broadly. So my DH work reflects my belief that our field can play a role in diversifying ways of seeing, ways of being in the academy, and providing opportunities to welcome less acknowledged voices and perspectives into the university. So as you'll see in my discussion of the projects that I've been involved in over the last years, this question of intervention in a very active sense, community building in a very active sense, and transformation in a very active sense have been at the base for much of these endeavors. So I suppose I'll say that the focus of my investment in digital humanities has perhaps more than anything else been an exercise in community building, because DH itself really does require community. It's a coming together of, I'd say, three distinct but also overlapping constituents: those who design, those who build, and those who theorize about design and building. So individuals can of course operate in all three of those capacities, right? Designing, building, theorizing about designing and building, but they are the kind of the building blocks of digital humanities projects. Importantly, digital humanities requires a coming together of interlocutors committed to querying the legitimacy, in fact, of the digital. So always sort of having in the back of the mind, is this necessary? Is this required? Is this built in a way that acknowledges the, as I said earlier, the human and the capital resources that will be necessary, not only to create the thing that we've come together to create, but to sustain it into a predetermined future, right? So I'll talk a little bit about the problems or the dangers of non-finitude, which is a temptation when it comes to something that seems as infinite as the internet and as the digital. So to talk a little bit about the collaborative work, the community building I've done over the last years, I'm going to walk you through a series of experiments in the Caribbean digital that I've gotten up to alongside a very close collaborator of mine, also at Columbia. Some of you may have worked with him or know him, Alex Heel, who is the digital scholarship coordinator for history and the humanities at Butler Library. And who works then not only individually with faculties on their research and pedagogical projects involved in digital technologies, but who also sort of supports efforts outside of the academy, and specifically in the Caribbean. Alex happens to be a PhD wielding Caribbeanist as well, so something of a unicorn for me, someone who's both interested in my field of study, but also has the technological chops to help realize some of these digital projects that I've been interested in making happen. So together, we convened an interinstitutional digital Black Atlantic workshop at Columbia that culminated in an online conference conversation that I'll talk to you about called Césaire Legacies. We founded and co-organized with a super colleague at CUNY, Kelly Baker Josephs. We founded and co-organized the Caribbean Digital, which is an annual international colloquium dedicated to digital work emerging in and about the Caribbean and its diasporas, and it's now in its 7th year. We've launched Archipelagos, which Mark mentioned earlier, which is a peer-reviewed online journal dedicated to Caribbean digital theory and practice. And lastly, we've been developing in the same boats toward an Afro-Atlantic intellectual cartography, which is an interactive data visualization that maps the trajectories and the intersections of Afro-Atlantic cultural actors in both time and space. And our aim in every facet of this collaboration has been to place the Americas, as I said, at the center of digital humanities scholarship, to show the ways in which not only can the Caribbean contribute in its content to discussions that are happening in the field of the digital humanities, but also in its methodologies and its approach to building in the digital humanities world. So sort of trying to, through these projects, model ways of ethical team building and technological innovation. We've worked, I think, more diligently than anything else to tap into and make space for an ever-widening circle of digi-curious Caribbeanist colleagues and to teach some skills in this realm along the way. And in the process of doing this, we've been steadily building a network of interconnected communal spaces that are dynamic in the present and are aimed at comprising archives of the future for our community. So now we come to the moment of truth and potential disaster, which is when I ask the tech to do my bidding. Nothing too fancy, I'm just going to try to share my screen. Now, this worked obviously in our earlier, but that means nothing. It could all go pear-shaped right now. Here we go, I'm gonna share my screen, I think. Can someone just indicate whether, maybe
That's
just
fine.
show?
That's
It's
good,
fine.
Kaiama.
Okay, yay, all right. Yay, the technology is working. Okay, so this is the first project I'm gonna show you, the Césaire Legacies project that I mentioned earlier. It's a web platform and conference, in fact, that we put together back in 2013 in collaboration with two of our colleagues at Columbia, Brent Edwards and David Scott, to commemorate the centenary of Aimé Césaire's birth in 1913. In 1913. So what we were trying to do here, beyond obviously the engagement with Césaire's life and work, our aim was actually to respond to a number of challenges we set for ourselves in the realm of digital humanism, in fact. So there were kind of 4 questions that went into the organization of the conference, and I'll show you how we attempted to answer those questions or to meet those challenges in the construction of this site. And the first question was, how could we do a conference cheaply while extending invitations to the widest possible audience? The second question was, how could we use digital technologies to engender a more, and this is related, engender a more inclusive, i.e. geo-independent community? How could we, that is, deprivilege access vis-a-vis those without the capital resources or the necessary papers, the visas, quite frankly, to travel to our New York City campus? Thirdly, how could we take an informal platform that is a web platform and turn it into a space for rigorous intellectual engagement? And then lastly, how could we leverage this encounter in cyberspace to generate a useful and material resource for absent and future colleagues? So maybe just to put a finer point on the why of these questions, right? So why are we trying to do, to think through this idea of doing something cheap that could extend invitations broadly to deprivilege the site of encounter as being physical in New York City, but make it something non-physical on the World Wide Web? The question, I think, for a lot of us who work on the Global South broadly, but in the Caribbean in particular, has to do with the fact that the subjects of our inquiry and our interlocutors as researchers, thinkers, scholars, collaborators are often cited in places that don't have access to the spaces that we do our work from, right? So this was a conference that was happening in Manhattan, New York, in the US in December. Which meant that many of the people coming, for example, from Haiti, would not necessarily be able to have the proper papers to be able to join us for the conference, or institutions that don't have budgets for faculty members or for students to travel internationally wouldn't be able to be physically present for the conversations we were hoping to generate over the course of the day we would spend together physically in New York City. So how could we make it such that we went beyond having folks Skype in or, but still sort of feel on the outside of something that was happening in a geographical space that delineated an inside? Well, we thought perhaps this could happen through this digital space, this conference that we created online. So this is the site. As you can see, or I don't know how much is self-explanatory, but I will explain. What we did was we invited 8 colleagues, Brent was one of them, to present remarks in the form of blog postings that corresponded with the equivalent of 4 panel topics. And they did so in the form of we posited a query, these 4 queries that you see here that are essentially the panel topics: whether or whether post-colonial sovereignty, the revolutionary Afro-Americas, transatlantic networks and context, the present-day poetic imagination. These were the 3 valences along which we wanted to think about Césaire's legacies. So we posed each of these panel topics to a pair of scholars and then asked them to write up relatively short blog postings, was the language you used then, and this is a blogging platform, to offer us a response to that query that we posed, then a counter response, and then a rejoinder. So let me show you what that looks like. So you would navigate to one of these panel topics and then land on a page that looks like this. So in this instance, it was Gary Wilder and Jarimar Bonilla, who were reflecting, both anthropologists, reflecting on this question of post-colonial sovereignty in the work of Césaire. So what happened was Gary Wilder proposed a response. Jarimar read his response, proposed a counter response, and then Gary had an opportunity to respond to her response. So just clicking on any one of these. Here are Gary's, here's Gary's posting. One would read through this, arrive at Jarimar's counter response, which is a response to Gary, obviously, and then Gary's final reflections on the same topic. So we did this for each one of these panels. Once we had this content, Alex and I launched this site about a month prior to the conference itself. And in each one of the panels, we then went ahead and opened the comment section and invited people who had registered for the conference to engage with what had been discussed by Gary and Jarimar, or Erica and Brent, or, right? So in each instance, people became involved, or we hoped invested in the conversation by participating in these discussions that happened in the comment section. And so what we did was we asked each of our interlocutors to monitor that comment section and themselves be responding to those who had replied in cyberspace. And our objective here, as I mentioned earlier, was to de-hierarchize what traditionally would have counted as the event, right? So the meeting in that Thursday, Friday in December, in favor of sustaining a conversation among as wide an audience as possible to essentially begin the conference and the exchanges in cyberspace. And so that meant that on the day of the analog event, the in-person conference, we were able, in fact, to flip the standard model whereby panelists each speak for 20 minutes and leave a few moments for Q&A at the end. Instead, what we did was during the live gathering, we essentially picked up where we had left off on the site, right? So we asked, we had the physical presence of all 8 of our scholars, but what they would do was they would engage with the things that had been brought up and had been ongoing conversations in the comments section and on the site during that month prior. So things that really reflected the interests of our community. And then in addition to the forum that we had, the live forum that we had finally at the end of this month, we included a workshop component to this commemoration in the form of a researchathon. Now, a researchathon is kind of a term that we came up with. You can see it here. And it's based on the model of, it's derived from the culture of the hackathon. I'll take you to the researchathon page. And you can, take your time to read here, but basically to summarize what we have here, the researchathon is derived from the culture of hackathon, very much familiar to technologists, in which programmers gather together to solve a software problem collaboratively. What our project focused on doing was building what was and what remains the largest existing bibliography of Aimé Césaire's primary and secondary sources in a form that would be open access on the open web and updatable in perpetuity, and involving scholars who were present then in the live event in December, but they're in our library, but also folks that were participating from elsewhere across the world. So we had sent out information about signing on to this researchathon at the same time that we launched the website, asked folks to kind of familiarize themselves with a fairly basic technology, which was Zotero, and then to join us remotely on the actual day. You can see here, roll up their sleeves and join us in this room where we literally spent about 6 hours building this bibliography. So this was our effort, answering this challenge to do the things that I mentioned earlier, right? So bring people into a space of both intellectual exchange, but also skills building and dynamic sort of participation in ways that didn't necessarily mean physical presence. So that was kind of the challenge we set and the ways we tried to meet it. The second project I'll show you much more briefly is our ongoing Caribbean Digital Conference, which is now in its 7th year. So, or was it? Yes, so the Caribbean Digital, which I put up here, as I mentioned, is now in its 7th year. Here, we returned to the traditional conference model, recognizing in this instance that a community that had shown itself to be functional and thriving in cyberspace might benefit from a physical gathering. So the distinction being this first conference had nothing to do with digital technology. It wasn't a gathering of digital humanists. It was a gathering of Césaire scholars or Caribbeanist scholars that we kind of brought into a digital sphere. The Caribbean Digital, as we conceived it, was exactly for a Caribbeanist digital humanist community. So folks who were already working very much in the digital and who we wanted to bring together to sort of collaborate side by side and to think side by side and exchange side by side. So this conference that we've been doing since 2014 alternates between a small format model with invited interlocutors, which we produce on our dime, meaning so we invite people to come and, you know, this was the example from last year. So you can see it's a rather contained, a contained program where we invite scholars from the Caribbean, across the US, obviously, and elsewhere, ranging from graduate students to senior faculty, from newbies in the field of digital humanities to very experienced colleagues. We bring them together in these smaller venues, and then every other year, so this is, as I said, a smaller venue, but we also have, sorry, I'm going to two screens here, kind of larger open call gatherings that we also have done. This was the first one, so it's taking a moment. It's in the Wayback Archive. Hide that. Where you can see it's a much broader and an expansive community that we brought together also. And when we do these kind of larger events, we do them in tandem with skills building workshops or with, as you see here, researchathons. So in this instance, I think it was the Kamal Brathwaite researchathon that we did. So this was a repeat, a repeat of the Césaire researchathon, but this time with a different figure. So we kind of took the website or the workshop that we had already done and placed it in this context. So yeah, so the Caribbean Digital Conferences, this alternating between these small gatherings and these large ones, are about kind of seeing what's out there and being in conversation with one another, and oftentimes generate new collaborations we found, and been very happy about that. We were scheduled to do one of our larger gatherings this year in Puerto Rico, but obviously that's looking improbable at this point. So we'll very likely, in fact, redeploy the Césaire Legacies model to host the conference on a more extended basis, sort of a month-long event that will culminate in something, but all taking place in cyberspace. So this kind of leads me to the third project that I've been involved in over the last years, which is Archipelagos, this journal of Caribbean digital praxis that Mark also mentioned. And it segues nicely from the Caribbean Digital, because this is essentially the space of, I guess what we think of as a space of recognition and reward in the ways of our academic context. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So this is Archipelagos. This is the first issue, but we've recently launched our 4th issue. So this just came to pass in March. So having established and identified and established relationships within this expanding networked Caribbean community, all of the folks you've seen, the names in the various Caribbean digital programs, for example, having established these relationships, we wanted to create a dedicated space of recognition for this community of scholars within the broader academic context. Specifically, we wanted to respond to the dearth of venues for accrediting digital humanist Caribbeanist scholarship, right? So Alex, my partner, my collaborator in particular, had long been aware of best practices in this context, right? So how do you peer review digital work? How do you make it such that the work that so many of, especially graduate students and junior scholars, are doing that are innovative and dynamic and incredibly useful to our respective fields, how do you recognize that in ways that are legible to tenure and promotion committees, to graduate departments, etc.? So with the help, the resource help of an NEH startup grant and within the embrace of the longstanding and prominent Caribbean Studies print journal, Small Acts, which is published by Duke University Press, we launched Archipelagos in 2000. Probably should know this, right? When was our first issue? 2016? Yes, 2016. And it's a peer-reviewed journal that is dedicated to digital scholarship. I'll bring us back to the fourth issue. To digital scholarship and scholarship about the digital that has emerged from and about the Caribbean and its diaspora. And as I said, so we've transitioned just this year, in fact, out of the Small Acts project, right? So the Small Acts journal, which some of you may be familiar with, is a very prominent Caribbean Studies journal. David Scott invited us to sort of incubate, if you will, Small Acts within its auspices and sort of under its umbrella and making use of its resources, its community. And we worked together with him on our first 3 issues, and then sort of launched this new, now that we feel that we're on our feet, if you will, this new independent digital platform, remains peer-reviewed, and now has its own robust community of reviewers and contributors, et cetera, that we've been able to keep going and sustain. Just to show you briefly what the, I hope I'm okay for time, I think I am, what the journal is about, or how it's structured rather, which is the important bit. I'll just open up the menu so you can see the various components of it. It's a platform that's organized into 3 valences. Each issue has 3 parts to it: an essays section, a digital project section, and a digital projects review section. And the distinction is this: the essays are in fact essentially traditional scholarly essays that are multimedia enriched. So what we wanted to do was create a space where very easily scholars would be able to integrate video, sound, social media, websites, etc., interactive features into articles that live their best lives online, right? So we're in the narrative content, while it could certainly exist, here we can look at Debt of Gratitude, for example, could certainly exist in a print journal, actually is better suited to the online context. So this is an essay that was done on Twitter, for example. So we have these embedded tweets from Lin-Manuel Miranda, in fact, in this instance, and Twitter pages, this various elements that this author chose to integrate directly into the reading experience, but in a way that is far less costly, obviously, than it would be to print such things in an online context, in an analog context. A more, perhaps, give you an example of one of our more multimedia instances. This is again Jarimar Bonilla, who her article Visualizing Sovereignty, entitled There Queries for the Digital Age, involved an enormous amount of map making videos and data visualizations. So being able to have the reader, the user, immediately have access to the subjects that she was talking about in her essay, for example. She also created various multimedia components for this text. So I can scroll down to this video that she created as part of her scholarship, for example. Without seeing you all, it's hard to tell how far I should go. But what I'll do is just give you this little taste, and whatever you're interested in, we can certainly come back to if we have time in Q&A. But just to, I'll just say, these are basically articles you would read in any peer-reviewed journal, but what we've done is encourage and invite folks who their scholarship is best suited to an online or an interactive platform to make the points and to do the research that they're interested in showcasing, to showcase the research they're interested in. So that's the essay section. Basic essays, multimedia embedded within. The second section was a little bit more challenging and weird, and not much done yet in the academy. The MLA has relatively recently laid out some best practices for this kind of thing as well. This is a digital project review section, which we kind of, if in reading our guidelines, you can walk through the steps on how to submit and how this review process works, but I'll walk you through it very, very simply. We invite, how should I put this? So it's similar to the model of the peer review process for a journal article, for example. We invite digital humanists, so people who have developed a digital humanities project, to submit an abstract and kind of a brief of that project along with the website to our editorial team. A member of our editorial board, in conjunction with another scholar from outside of the Archipelagos team, conducts a single blind peer review on that project, meaning obviously because it's a website, we know who the author of the site is, but the site author will not know who the peer reviewer is, right? That peer reviewer then offers to the site author a full sort of peer review of their project, along 4 different valences, which I don't have to get into them, or I can just say what they are now. Design, content, preservation, and credit, right? So how recognizable is the credit structure? And sends that back to the reviewer, the author. The author then has an opportunity to, over the course of 3 to 4 months, make whatever revisions to the site they feel are appropriate, and then also respond in narrative to the kind of like a response to a report on manuscript, to respond to the site author. And what we then do is we launch that site through Archipelagos along with the entirety of an edited version of the entirety of that back and forth peer review exchange. So here, for example, this project, Cariciland, which comes out of the island of Dominica, Shiler Esprit is the site author. We do a presentation of the site here, and then the reviewer, the Archipelago reviewer, which is a combination of the review from our editorial board member and the outside reviewer, goes ahead and reviews that site, and then the site author responds to that review, indicating what in the site has changed or hasn't, and why or why not, based on this peer review exchange. So this is both in the effort of establishing a recognizable peer review model for digital humanities work, one that aligns with that set out by the MLA, for example, but then also to render transparent the process of reviewing these projects. We all feel like we understand and we know how to review an article, how to review a book, but do we know how to review digital humanities work? And so by rendering this process transparent, we hope to make it legible to folks who are not necessarily, have not necessarily taken the digital turn, if you will. And then the third and final valence of this third project I've been showing you is back to the more recognizable. It's the digital project reviews. And these are simply reviews that are modeled on, I'll go from our issue 1, which is, we've got 2 of them, which are modeled on a book review. Right? So in these instances, we don't ask an author to submit a website or a site that's in process, but rather we go out on the hunt ourselves for fully realized digital projects that are out there in the field of Caribbean studies. And we invite we invite a reviewer to do a published review, just on the same model as a scholarly book review, right? So there is no back and forth, there is no consultation with the site author. This is, here's a site online, and here are its benefits or its usefulness to the community, here are some critiques, etc. So, and we publish these just as such, right, as reviews. So that is Archipelagos. I think I said everything. Oh yeah, maybe actually just a couple of things I wanted to say about the structuring of Archipelagos, what we built here, because just in the same way that we thought carefully about the modeling of structures in building the 2 conferences I mentioned, here we were really concerned with how editors and publishers might encourage and facilitate investment in the production and the dissemination of knowledge about the Caribbean. By what means could producers and reviewers of quality digital scholarship be cultivated? And importantly, how could they be recognized and rewarded by our profession? And so we really thought through this archipelagos platform with a constant eye to the ethics of our back end, right? So the things that are beneath the visual, the engagement that the user has with the site. We charge no author fees. Archipelagos is fully open access. All our authors retain their copyright. We pursue best indexing, accessibility, and archival practices. Our website and our PDFs are static, which means they don't rely on a constantly updating database. And so the resulting website is lightweight, it's mobile friendly, and that recognizes the importance of cell phones and bandwidth differentials and data costs in the Caribbean and the global South more broadly. We also version and we share our software and data freely on an open repository on GitHub, meaning that anyone can kind of look in and replicate or tweak for their own purposes a similar static model of journal production. And as you can see, we have also moved to multilinguality. So this site, while all the content is not yet available in multiple languages, all of the structuring elements are available in French, English, and Spanish, right? So the menu and anything that is the structure of the site and information from the editors to our users. So, you know, there's much more to do on all of those levels: accessibility, multilinguality, and preservation even, but we think we've built something that will stand the test of time in these respects, and most importantly, be easily tweakable and adjustable moving forward without requiring the intervention of a fancy, expensive software developer or web designer. This is something that we do in-house. I'm capable of coding a fair amount of this, and I am really something of a Luddite when it comes to programming and coding, so that's saying quite a lot. But even if it weren't me, anyone with some fairly basic skills in HTML and CSS could replicate or tweak or fix this site should it need fixing. All right, I feel like I'm going on for a long time. Again, not having a visible audience makes it hard to understand what people are thinking in terms of exhaustion. But last project, this ever-evolving collaboration that I've had with Alex has culminated in the development of the final platform. I'm going to show you one that's more explicitly linked to my personal analog scholarship, and this is the project that I was working on while I was at the Institute. It's called In the Same Boats, toward an Afro-Atlantic intellectual cartography. And it's a project that that has its own value to me as a digital humanities project, but then also has been useful to me in the research and in the work that I'm doing in an analog context in the intellectual biography I've been working on, which I'll explain this all in just a second. I don't have much more, I promise. So what Same Boats is an interactive map that traces the movement of intellectuals and artists from the Caribbean and the wider Americas through the Atlantic world. And this is a project that was really born of my personal frustration as a francophonist with the limits and the constraints of my positioning, both in my graduate training and then as a professor and a scholar within the linguo-cultural bounds of a university French department. I was trained to operate and have become accustomed to operating on the margins of what remains a decidedly Eurocentric structuring of our academy. I spent much of my time, and then of course crucially as a junior faculty member, much of my professional development efforts working to make it in French, publishing, conferencing, and collaborating more often in spaces defined by the French language than in those that would have allowed perhaps for more expansive global South-sided connections. And obviously this is not an uncommon phenomenon, because indeed, despite our oft-expressed aim of transcending borders in the Caribbean, the study of global South intellectual production has been stubbornly balkanized, its limits and its contours largely determined by the elsewheres of empire. Scholars of the Americas are often in the position, as I noted earlier, of negotiating nation language frontiers that are the persistent legacies of colonialism, as much in the academy as in the wider world, right? So what I mean is that the partitioning of the post-colonial into Anglophone, Francophone, Hispanophone, and Lusophone spaces, that persists despite being in so many ways at odds with the shared sociocultural and historical realities of the Afro-Atlantic. And so Same Boats was meant to be something of a pushback against the walls of these academic silos. It's a platform that we're hoping will render visually impactful and easily accessible the various dimensions of a multilingual and profoundly networked Afro-Atlantic world. And it looks a little something like this. I put these in separate tabs. Let me just close some of this out. So you can see on the left here, we have these four tabs. I'm just gonna, these four links that we can go to directly. I've opened them as tabs just for the purposes of show and tell. So here we have the basic trajectories. Some of you who may have seen the talk I did at the Institute or were present, I hope, will be familiar with this. It's gotten a little better since then. But what we're going for is a way of showing visually and immediately the movement of these intellectuals or these cultural actors through time and space in the Atlantic and actually beyond the Atlantic world. We have 9 figures here which represent the 9 complete data set that we have from the, how many do we have? 28 scholars who are currently working on them. But the data has to be in a fairly robust state before it can be uploaded to the visualization. And I'm sorry for all this like jargon and nonsense speak, but it's, I'll show you what those terms refer to. But just very quickly, this is my data set to start with. This is Wonu de Bestre, the Haitian author that I'm working on, an intellectual biography of, and for whom this project has been of immense help to understanding his trajectory, as you'll see. So if we start, you'll see that there's just one dot on the map right now, and that's where de Bestre was born in Haiti, in the Caribbean. But this timeline feature enables me to kind of trace or to see the moments of movement in his trajectories, right? So when he goes to Europe, or then when he comes back over to across the Atlantic at some point, moving backward and forth between Europe and Eastern Europe at one point. If we keep going down into Italy, I remember that's where he takes the boat and goes over to Cuba, right? His period of time in Latin America, we can see. And then there's going to be one point, because he lived in Cuba for 20 years during the Cold War, we will see him move over into, sorry, that timeline I'm doing too slow, move over into Eastern Europe, Russia, and Asia. You can see there's a little problem with the visualization there. This is of some interest to me, working on this kind of life story of Wonu de Bestre. All of these nodal points. This is going to be launched, we're hoping, in August, so there's still some tweaking to be done. At the moment, these nodal points indicate the place, and then there's a citation that that indicates where the verification of him, us knowing he was in that place comes from. These pop-up windows are going to be changed. They are actually going to, instead of having citation information, some descriptive content about what was going on during the time that figure was in that place. And I'll show you where that information is drawn from when I show you a little bit of the back end of this project. So this kind of gives some big picture information, the combination of the map and the timeline indicating de Bestre's movement throughout the world. What we're hoping will also be of interest, not just to the individual figures, right? And I realize I've skipped a step in, well, maybe I haven't. I'll explain how these individual figures come to pass, is seeing how the trajectory of someone like Wonu de Bestre pairs with another figure from the Atlantic world. Perhaps you could try George Lamming, for example, who is an Anglophone Caribbean writer, and see if and when they line up, right? And start thinking about maps of networks and wondering, you know, if we pick a spot, like where are we here? We're in France, we only have de Bestre there. Are there places, right? So we've got George Lamming in London at a similar time. Just kind of getting some comparative sense of who was where when. I can see where Aimé Césaire was with respect to Lamming and de Bestre in the period of the 1940s into the early 1950s, etc. This is kind of one way of seeing these networks, or these parallel or divergent movements between these different scholars. We have another type of visualization, which are the intersections. And here too, instead of though, we can see less movement and more placement, and rather than the focus being on generating from the individual, it's the place that determines, that gives the value of the information. So here, we can just look at the kind of populating of the transatlantic world. All we have here are a series of dots. Who knows what they mean? You're about to. So these dots obviously represent places. I can say that one of the post-beta tweaks we'll be making is we're buying a zoom function. This is probably the most expensive thing that we decided we can't do with our own modest capabilities, or more and less modest capabilities, but a zoom function so we can see a little more clearly what's happening in each of these circles. Why does that say DC? It shouldn't. So here we are in Marseille, France. And so as I said, instead of the figures generating the information, it's the space that tells us who has passed through Marseille, France, and at what time. I don't know if on your various screens you can see as clearly as I can here, but what you have with the various authors is some that are that are darker and some that are faded. And this corresponds to the darkness and the fadedness of the circles as well. This was our effort to indicate ambiguity, right? We know for certain, based on archival information that has been provided by the scholars participating in this project, that Claude McKay was in Marseille at this time. We have information that intimates that W.E.B. Du Bois was in this place at this time, but we can't be certain. And so as you can see from the legend down here, rings equal possible intersections, solid circles indicate definite intersections. So we're trying to understand ambiguity a bit, but as you can see, the timeline functions similarly. We can start to understand how the Atlantic world and beyond was populated by the various figures. There are only 9 in this instance of the platform, but when things start going from being just US and Europe into Africa, into Latin America, into Asia, etc. Right? So that's the second visualization. And so what we're going for is a literal relational tracing of hemispheric Black intellectual and cultural history, one that ultimately reveals proximities that otherwise might be missed, kind of cartographic archive that's developed within and thanks to truly a modestly digicapable Caribbean community, truly modestly, because to participate in this project really only takes minimal skills. And with those minimal skills, one can make a meaningful contribution. Essentially, individual scholars from Europe, the Caribbean, the US, elsewhere, use their expertise to generate unique data sets using simple spreadsheets. Some of you have seen this spreadsheet before. This is mine, the Renew de Vespa spreadsheet. I've customized it to reflect my interests, right? Because I'm writing this intellectual biography. I've periodized de Vespa's life by color block vis-a-vis the places in the world he found himself at any point in time. So his time in Haiti, his time in France, his time bopping around various parts of Western Europe, his time spent in Latin America, his return to France, his return to the Caribbean, his 20 years in Cuba, his movement through Russia and to Moscow in particular, and then various other punctual movements during his time living in Cuba during the Cold War, and then finally the last part of his life based in France, but traveling to other parts of the Caribbean and France. And so what you see here is the data sheet. We have 28 of them now, so each of the 28 figures that is kind of taken charge of by an individual editor. So one editor working on one figure, but that editor can of course have collaborators or students that they have involved in the process. Vanessa Agar-Jones, for example, one of our colleagues at Columbia, involved her class in producing a data sheet like this for Fonds Fanon. Unfortunately, that was interrupted by events we know. But in any event, these are the data sheets that produce both the trajectories and the intersections visualization. The arrival, presence, and departure presence columns, along with the notes, are what we use to generate the visualizations. Everything else is part of the individual scholar's archive, right? So the notes, I should have mentioned, correspond with the search function, right? So they're what enable us to put in, oops, I'm typing on the wrong computer, so I'm using 2 screens here, sorry. Something like, oops, there you go, let's try that again. I'll try something smaller, festival. Type in a word like festival and see how many of the figures in the existing visualization might have been at the same exact festival. So what we're hoping is that the notes information will encourage users of the visualization to investigate encounters that they may not have come across in their own engagement with their unique figure or within their unique nation language space, for example. Just returning to my data set / archive for the moment, just to say that what I've been using this for, in addition to producing the visualizations on the site, is a place to kind of store information that corresponds, meaning that I've added additional components to my archive, works published, key encounters, that say to me, as I look in my own scholarship, well, okay, while Dubest was in the Czech Republic, who did he meet? What did he publish? In what ways then can I sort of think about situatedness in thinking about the intellectual production of this particular author? So we can get more into this later if you're interested, but that's just to give a broad overview of this place, of this project. So as with the other, I'm going to wrap up here, the other projects I've shown you this afternoon, Same Boats is an iteration of our way of imagining Afro-Atlantic archives of the future. Here, as with all of these platforms, we've availed ourselves of many of the affordances of the digital, and we've also been obliged to confront its inherent lacunae and its constraints. And among the most frustrating is the extent to which the accessibility we cherish is largely contingent on corporate and colonial structures we otherwise would work explicitly and implicitly to undo. And that's a bind that isn't unique, obviously, to the digital context. But in the case of the 4 projects I've talked about today, in our efforts to make them relatively cheap and nimble, open access and sustainable, we've had to rely on WordPress, on the Mercator map projection, on Google spreadsheets, and on English as our lingua franca. So while our intentions are very much decolonial, our operations are less so. Nonetheless, as I hope I've shown, in each instance, we've really built these platforms with intention and care, both with respect to content and to craft. We've been willing to fail out loud in front of a whole wide web, and I think the work has been the better for it. So I'll end there, and thank you all for listening and for being present.
Thank you so much. That was,
I'm sorry that went long. Yeah.
No, I think the difficulty of Zoom lectures is just that you don't have a sense of how people are responding. But I was speaking for myself. Speaking
Into the void.
No, it was really, really interesting. So thank you. And we have time for questions. And I think we can do this in the usual way, that people could raise their hand. And if you're happy, Kaiama, to check out on the chat function, then
sure, I've got that open.
Raise their hand. Well, let's kick off with Debashri, who I see has already raised her hand.
Hello, Debashri. Please, yes.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Thanks so much for this. It was really useful to see all the various models that you're experimenting with. I mean, one of the things I think that really surprised people is the amount of work you have to do before that map appears. So putting all that data into an Excel sheet, I think, I mean, just talking to colleagues, they just think that you run like your data through a machine and the maps appear.
I used to think that way. I'm not laughing at that idea.
No, I started going to digital humanities conferences. So one of the questions I had was, a lot of the work that a software can do for you, it is only as intuitive as the information you enter into a data sheet and the metadata you create. And I'm wondering if one of the things I've thought would be useful with some of the projects I work on is to really make some of these projects collaborative, in the sense that invite more and more users as participants to enter metadata. And then there's all these surprising results. So I'm wondering which of your projects lend themselves to that kind of just open, blind collaboration. And the other thing I think it'd just be useful for the whole group to hear your thoughts on this is how much the design
I'm sorry, can you get how much what?
How much the design of a digital project changes the kinds of questions that you would ask as a conventional analog historian, and how much the design determines the kinds of answers or the way one presents those answers. So one of the things we did see in your presentation was visualization. So maps and a kind of spatial history of certain things. So if you could just talk a little bit more about how how the project doesn't come with certain assumptions about outcomes, but the design also determines so much of how we think, how we pose questions, and so on.
Thank you so much, Debashri. Those are excellent and super useful questions, because they are the questions that we pose in putting these things together. So to the first one, you know, the idea of opening up to have contributors provide necessary metadata for this backend, that really ended up being something of a cautionary tale. You know, we've been at work at this, we're going on 3.5 years now. It's been slower than we, slower than we hoped, but hasn't rendered us hopeless. And because we did mean to do this and learn something from it, and we have, and it's been useful to developing the project. But one of the things we did learn in doing something collaborative like this is that opening up the back end is messy business. Is messy business. So when we first started out, it was our utopian dream, in fact, that this would be an all hands on deck, everyone get in there and do it, and then the thing would be generated by this community. But what we had to acknowledge is that it is a number of things. First of all, people's interest in the building versus the final project varies. And that's fine with us. But people's skills also. We needed to determine early on, are we going to make part of building this project teaching how to build this project? And we did start by trying to do that. And what it ended up doing was slowing us down enormously, because we had to, it was a, what is that? When you do 2 steps forward, 1 step back, we had to keep backtracking and cleaning the metadata, because the visualization kept breaking because it improperly entered information. So what we came up with was this Google Spreadsheets design, presuming, and even that was something of a presumption beyond, presuming that everyone was familiar with Excel, right? But that, you know, good, fine. That's absolutely fine, but it's the case. Not everyone works in spreadsheets. I didn't work in spreadsheets really before I did this. So to really boil it down to the most common element and then have people utilize that. But even that, and you know, we know our colleagues, right? We're like brilliant people, but we're not super great at following instructions sometimes or meeting deadlines. And so when you have a collaborative project that's working on the timeline of, you know, 30 people, at some point we had to say, we'll take care of some of those basic elements. So even for, you know, when I showed the, just quickly, this data sheet, we used to have people enter the places and the dates on their own. You would think that would be something, you know, not too controversial. But really getting everyone to enter properly written dates in the order that the computer requires to generate the visualization, or to use consistent place names and put the city, the county or state, and the country in the correct order. It wasn't the best use of our time going back and cleaning that up. So we turned this into an algorithm. We have systematized. You can enter we use now, as you can see, a drop-down menu. You can't see, right? So we've eliminated that. However you enter your date now, it'll show up in the right format. So things like that. What we're now working on is getting folks to utilize the notes in a way that's consistent and helpful to us. So we have some people that, we all take notes differently, right? So some people write thoughts that they have to themselves in the notes. And so the reason we haven't launched the note function on the visualization is in part because we need some systematization in that front as well. We need people to follow a certain way of writing notes with recognizable terms that are consistent so that it works for the search function. So that was something of a long-winded answer, I'm sorry, to your question, but just to say, there's such a gray area in collaboration on when it makes sense to open up these kinds of things and when you have to be a little bit more, I don't know, dictatorial is too strong a word, but like, you know, when you have to kind of hold the reins yourself. And as to this design, I mean, I feel like you know the answer to that question because it was so beautifully posed. Absolutely, the design determines the questions and shapes the narrative. What we've tried to do in designing this project in particular, was make it as bare bones as possible in the visualizations so that we don't in any way generate too much. Like, we're really trying to offer this as more of a service than to generate a narrative. The point of it is for people to come to the project and create from the very simple and bare bones information that's provided there, exchanges, maybe reach out to other scholars to investigate and drill down into intersections in these trajectories, but not for us to tell those stories. In our pipe dreams of where the project will go, we will apply for funding for a summer institute where we can actually bring some of the folks together to talk about pedagogical or research projects that could be generated from things that emerge from the visualizations. But that's not our first priority. It's really to get the information out there and make it accessible to our various communities. But you're absolutely right. Everyone owns their data every editor owns their data, and we have encouraged people, and some have, to take their data sets and transform them into their own fancy maps with bells and whistles that correspond to their visualization desires. But for us, it's really, here's as objective and basic as we can get in terms of providing information.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
We can't hear you, Kaiama.
Really?
Okay, now it's okay.
I had been muted, yeah.
Who you asked Robert to?
Oh, I was saying you or Robert. I said you, but you're
okay. Fine. Well, thank you so much. I found it all really actually inspiring.
Mark?
Someone's talking to you, Mark.
Okay, let's see who's. Okay, I'll go ahead. Okay. I was particularly interested in the map, actually. It's very inspiring, and thank you. I had a question, which was that when I hear you outlining, especially at the start, the combination of factors that were in your mind as you were moving into this realm, I heard a concern about two perhaps overlapping communities. And one was an academic community, or more precisely, how you could advocate for Caribbeanists within the larger appropriate realms in American academia, perhaps also for Haitian scholars within the Caribbeanist community. But these were academic communities and sub-communities, and where you would fit within that, and so forth. And then there is another conception of your role, which is actually moving well beyond the academy, making what you do available to people who might have to use their cell phones to access what you do, to contribute to what you do, people in the Caribbean, people in Haiti. You gave us examples of a number of different projects, and they have different audiences and different purposes. I appreciate that. An online digital journal, peer-reviewed, is different from some of the other things. So my question was really about that second audience, the one on the islands. And how do you think about reaching them, and how do you tell if you are reaching them in the ways that you want to, and so on?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mark. I would clarify simply by saying that those two audiences are often, and in some ways regrettably, one and the same, i.e. academic communities, and I'll say particularly in Haiti, which is where, from my work I'm most concerned, are often, my colleagues there are the same folks who are under-resourced in terms of access to technology, and at various points, and this has been the case as we've been working with Puerto Rico to do the conference in the fall, themselves are limited to cell phones or to low bandwidth environments. The simple fact of recurring natural disasters in the Caribbean makes access to libraries, to university campuses, to technologies, ironically, not dissimilar to what we're experiencing right now in the so-called global north, right? Meaning that in thinking through these projects, from the conference to the journal to the mapping project, and thinking about the technology that is in their back end, I'd say first and foremost, we've been thinking about our intellectual and academic collaborators in those spaces. and really recognizing how odd it feels oftentimes to be in Caribbean conferences in the US where there are very few people from the Caribbean because of issues of resources, visas, etc. Or the fact that so many of our journals and our publications are behind university firewalls that certain institutions in the Caribbean don't have the funds to be able to access, right? So yeah, just to say that, it's not two distinct audiences, in fact.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Robert, you wanted to ask something?
Yes. First of all, on a personal note, my granddaughter is graduating from Barnard this semester.
Oh.
I cite that in terms of this model, which is very exciting, the way you've built this, obviously was created in the pre-coronavirus era. And here we are smack in the middle of that. Do you envision that at some point you as a professor would be able to use this in building curriculum or coursework, working with students?
It's a great question. And I started off by saying at the beginning of this talk that I hope that some of these projects will read to you all as space as a possibility in whatever world we emerge into in the academy on the other side of this. But your point is well made. This was something that originated prior to the pandemic, prior to this disaster that we're currently in, and it has been being used in the classroom already. So I mentioned very briefly, one of our colleagues, Vanessa Agar-Jones at Columbia, had spent an entire semester working with her students in that class to build that data sheet for France Fanon, for example. And so it was part of a pedagogical plan that she had in that class. But I'm hoping that, and I think this is what we're all going to have to wrap our heads around a little bit come fall and beyond, that what we've been trying to do is show the ways in which the digital is not the poor cousin of the in-person and the analog, but a welcome, family member, terrible metaphor, a welcome complement to the work that we're doing. And so that these transitions hopefully will feel less like dragging and more like, okay, well, what can we do differently? As we move towards hybrid or flipped classrooms, I think among our undergraduates, we'll see that they are incredibly adaptable and capable of thinking through their screens. Here too, there will be some cautions. I've discovered in working with students that there is a real difference between being adept on Instagram and being able to use HTML. But the willingness to see the black mirror that is our computer screens as a positive and productive and intellectually equivalent space is something they seem very ready to do. And so I've been using this in my classrooms. I've been using archipelagos in my classroom. I've been touting open access as a way for students to so easily dip and weave through, in this case, the Archipelagos Journal, but other online peer-reviewed publications. So yeah, I do think this will be valuable. Thank you for the question.
Because I think that very quickly, they are conditioned to the use of this instrument, if you will.
The instrument,
so you will be engaging them in something that's very familiar to them.
I hope so. And I hope that they'll see clearly the ways to kind of transfer their openness and their skills from Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter to Google spreadsheets in this instance, or to WordPress, or to et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Kaiama, this is probably about the time that we normally wrap up, but I just want to say this was very inspiring, partly because we are all trying to rethink what the place of the digital will be right now in our work and our teaching and in our research. And you've been engaged with this in such a creative and productive way that's at the same time true to the aspirations of scholarship. It's really admirable. So
everyone feel free to reach for me outside of this forum. Obviously, I'm happy to engage.
Thank you so much. I just briefly, before we thank you, I want to say two things. One, we're about to announce, yes, there will be a class of fellows next year. They are going to probably arrive later than usual in January, but inshallah they will arrive, and they're a wonderful group, and we're going to announce them very soon, so look out for that. Next week, we are going to be joined from Peru by Pauchi Sasaki, who is going to be, I'm not sure if, well, talking to us about sound dress number 3. And her really quite extraordinary work in humanizing technology through sound and gesture. So I recommend that, but we've been very fortunate today to hear Kaiama Glover, and I will just show my appreciation, Kaiama, to you for joining us. Thank you so.
Thank you. Thank you all. I really appreciate you having been here and listening. Take care. Be well.
Kaiama.
Stay safe.
Good
Bye
to
bye.
see you.
Bye. It's so good to see some of you, especially in the face. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.